And you're good to go, Norma.
Thank you, Saul. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to New Plaza's Classic Film Talkback. As Saul said, I'm Norma Levy, president of New Plaza, and we are a nonprofit offering independent and foreign films and providing educational talkbacks and other programs about classic cinema. Today, our curator, Gary Palmucci, has chosen a marvelous 1961 film called Paris Blues. It stars Paul Newman and also stars Sidney Poitier, Joanne Woodward, and Diane Carroll. It's a wonderful film and appropriate for this program, which is a special tribute to Paul Newman. Gary will be joined in this talkback by his good friend, the film historian, Max Alvarez. He will also be joined by several special guests that we're very excited to have and who will be introduced to you later. So I hope you enjoy the talkback and this special tribute to Paul Newman. And it's with great pleasure that I now turn this over to Gary.
Well, hi, everyone. From our conversations and our rehearsal earlier this week, I can tell you that we have a very special program in store today. Centered around this will be the film Paris Blues, which I've seen a couple times over the years. Most recently, a few summers ago, on a late August evening in a small but convivial outdoor space in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, the Jane Bailey Community Garden. The screening sponsored by BAM. And it was one of those screenings where among the 100 or so people squeezed into the space, you could really sense that vibe of everyone thinking, or many of them thinking, why haven't I heard of this movie before? Max, I'm sure you've experienced that occasionally.
That's true, because I had the same reaction when I saw Paris Blues, and it's an easy film to get lost in the shuffle, because when we think about 1961, 6 months before Paris Blues came out, Sidney Poitier was in A Raisin in the Sun, which got a big play, and then the same month Paris Blues came out, that's when Paul Newman starred in The Hustler.
Wow.
Greatest films. So it's easy for a film like Paris Blues to get lost in the shuffle, unfortunately. But it's a wonderful, extraordinary discovery, I think.
Well, the director, Martin Ritt, and Newman had worked several times before that. And one of the many screenwriters, and we'll get to that later, Walter Bernstein, it was the first of several collaborations with Martin Ritt. And Walter Bernstein is actually still with us. He turned 100 recently. And I saw him at a screening in New York as recently as 2016, a documentary about Sidney Lumet, for whom he wrote Failsafe and I think one or two other pictures. So in 1961, an incredible year, first year of the Kennedy administration. And there's some other world-class talent involved in the film. The legendary French production designer, Alexander Tronner, who worked on Children of Paradise, a number of Billy Wilder's films, including The Apartment, and a legendary French cinematographer, Christian Matras, who worked on Jean Renoir's Grand Illusion and Max Ophuls' spectacularly acrobatic moving camera films, The Earrings of Madame Deux and Lola Montez, one of which I hope we can feature on the program here at some point. So,
and he also shot La Ronde for Max Ophuls. And Alexander Tronner, he had done, as you mentioned, work in the French film industry, and then was designing work for Billy Wilder, such as The Apartment, and then Irma la Douce, which is a Hollywood-based Paris film. But Paris Blues was, to my knowledge, filmed entirely in France. Even the clearly artificial streets that they recreated were done in French studios. And in the very beginning, you see this magnificent panning shot of Paris. And then it transitions to what we call a traveling match shot as it morphs into the Alexander Tronner recreation of a Parisian street. With
right. I mean, pretty smooth for its time. But then suddenly, after that opening cityscape, we're on what is clearly a set where the characters first meet and have some banter.
And it's funny when you read reviews from 1961 about Paris Blues, the critics are complaining about the monotonous shots of Paris, the location shots of the two couples walking through the city. Well, those are one of the great high points today because they're this remarkable cinematic record of this magnificent city during a very explosive cultural time.
Well, it's again one of our favorite. I couldn't really call them a studio because United Artists, own no studio or actual real estate of their own in that way, but they made movies happen, particularly during this time. Films that were often provocative and handling touchy or complex subject matter. Of course, The Manchurian Candidate, which we did a few weeks ago, one of our all-time favorites. This is another UA release, and their trailers were kind of up and down in terms of how they presented the films, but I think by and large this one's not bad. I guess it's time to take a look at it.
It isn't too bad, and this is the original trailer for Martin Ritt's Paris Blues that United Artists would have distributed to cinemas in 1961. Let's see how it plays.
Some motion pictures move you deeply, others not at all. Some pictures you love, some you hate. Here is one which is bound to catch you up in its different kind of love story. You might call it a love spectacular. So intimately exciting, you feel it's happening to you. Paris Blues. A room in Paris can be like no other room in the world. The things they do, the things they say.
You come on like this with all the guys?
No, only with the special ones.
They haunt you and hold you, like the Paris Blues. Come to Paris, the city that was made for love, and meet its young lovers.
Continuez. Continuez. What do you want to do, wrap me up and take me home? We had a good thing going. What do you have to spoil it for? I got my life all arranged like I told you. I got no time for what you want.
Nobody in this whole world is ever going to be as right for you as I was. For 12 days in Paris in the autumn.
But I love you. I love you.
I would give that about a B for not for blowing the ending of the film a little bit or revealing too much. But otherwise, not bad.
Well, I love that line. He could blow up a storm with himself in the middle of it. So that's UA going for the big deal. And just one brief comment is that this is also important. Martin Ritt and Walter Bernstein were both survivors of the Hollywood blacklist. So even though Bernstein was one of several screenwriters, this is an important comeback in many ways for them as well.
That's right. In the mid-'70s, they actually collaborated on a film called The Front, where Woody Allen played a blacklisted writer. You have a couple of on-set photos, Max. You're going to save for later, right?
I'm going to save it for later. Yes, that are quite memorable.
All right. Well, let's introduce our very special guests here and get to it.
Absolutely, and very special they are. Joining Gary and I today in our talk back on Paris Blues. First of all, we have Melissa Newman, who's an artist and who works primarily in porcelain and stoneware. She's shown her work around the Northeast, with pieces included in the 2012 Hamptons Show House. And she very modestly performs frequently with her jazz trio, which I hear are magnificent. She spent almost 20 years volunteering and working with the inspiring women at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility. She teaches art and singing there and also in other communities. And just a slight additional factoid, Melissa Newman also just happens to be the daughter of Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. And then joining Melissa Newman today is Wayne Winborn. He's the executive director of the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University in Newark. It's the largest and most comprehensive jazz and jazz-related facility and archive in the world. He's also an assistant professor in arts, culture, and media, and is a frequent presenter at conferences on issues related to jazz, art, culture, and democracy. Needless to say, we at New Plaza Cinema are honored and thrilled to have Melissa Newman and Wayne Winborn with us today. Welcome.
Yes, welcome. Well, Melissa, you know, that phrase "present at the creation" has become kind of a cliche here, but I think in your case and in Paris Blues, it really applies. Maybe you can explain further.
Yes, my relationship to Paris Blues. Every time we would visit Paris, my mother would love. Why am I so nervous? I feel like all these people are watching us now. Not a natural performer, right? Yeah, my mom would always walk. We would walk by a street in Montmartre, and she would point at a building and say, "That's where we made you. That's where you were conceived." And she would always shout it out. And I was a teenager; it was really embarrassing. But I will say that Paris Blues it came out on my birthday, literally the day of my birth, September 27th, 1961. So you do the math. And I just realized that when I'm watching the film, a lot of what I'm looking for, knowing that my parents were very much together at the time, really trying to look for hints of their relationship in the work as it's happening, like the looks and the relationship that's happening in the film, and just knowing that they were actually having a relationship at the time, and that I was in the movie, if you want to look at it that way. Theoretically. So that is my relationship to Paris Blues. And also there was always I don't think it's a rumor, I think it's absolutely true, a rumor that I sat in Louis Armstrong's lap when I was a baby, because I think they still maintain a connection. And so I became a jazz singer, so go figure. It's something rubbed off. So that was like through my diaper, right? Me and Louis Armstrong. I'm proud of that.
That's great. Wayne Winborn, would it be fair to say that this was a more serious attempt by Hollywood to take on jazz, because they dealt with it a little superficially before? Were they really trying to get jazz accurately here? And this is a question for both of you, since Melissa, you're also a jazz singer.
Yeah, thank you for letting me be a part of this. It's fantastic. I really like this movie. I know I'm not, nobody cares, nor should they, about my opinion of the movie. But
we do.
I thank so much for letting me be a part of this. Yeah, I think my read on it is that it absolutely was an attempt by Hollywood to get it right. Now, you know, you get an A for effort, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the outcome is what people would have wanted or expected. It's very tough, of course, to capture this music with all of its complexities in terms of its origins and the folks who love it, the people who love the music but don't like the people who created the music, the lack of acceptance in some quarters of formal music study that had happened. And you have to think about the time, too, 1961, where we were as a country, where the world was. So, you know, long-winded answer there. Yeah, I think they were trying to get it right. I think it's a mixed bag. I think they did a pretty good job in some ways. I'm kind of surprised. I'm always a bit jaded when folks try to capture this music or its very important figures, you know. But I think they actually did a good job. It's not a great movie. I don't think it's spectacular, but it could have been. But I think it's pretty good actually. The music, of course, is fantastic. And I guess the only complaint you could make, the only complaint I might make is that, you know, they, as happened a lot, unfortunately, to him, uh, Billy Strayhorn's contribution just got kind of buried. You know, it was Duke. The music up front, I think the credit up front says music by Duke Ellington, which of course was a great calling card for the authenticity and validity they wanted the film to have. But they don't say, you know, I don't think they mention Strayhorn anywhere in the credits. I'm not sure even, I think the re-release of the CD corrects it, you know. So for example, take the A Train, the famous tune is actually Strayhorn's tune. I mean, it's Billy Strayhorn wrote Take the A Train, not Duke Ellington. And again, they had a symbiotic relationship, very close writing partners. Duke relied on Strayhorn heavily, you know, to finish commissions that he had accepted, even when the band was on the road. And so he's out touring, but he owes someone or some institution a commission. Strayhorn would finish things. They'd have ideas. For people who really delve deeply, you can tell Strayhorn's writing. You know, there's some signature things he does. There's some voicings and orchestrations that he uses that can only be characterized as beautiful. And not that Duke didn't write beautiful things too, but that in particular, I think that's an adjective that's associated with Strayhorn. And so there are moments where a real jazz head is going to close their eyes and go, "Oh, no, that's a Strayhorn piece right there. That's Strayhorn." And then there are other times, the closing number, for example, where it's like, that's Duke Ellington. That's Duke making you want to get up and dance. You know, that's Duke wanting you to nod your head and snap your fingers. So,
but Wayne, they did other films together.
So Duke,
they did a couple of other, but my understanding too is that this was probably the one where they were really given the freest reign. They actually used the music that they wrote, and that the idea and the commitment to the music was as you know, it's Hollywood. I mean, I think that's an interesting thing about the film is that, you know, there was a commitment to, like, in the beginning they flirted with this biracial relationships, with really committing to the music, with all these things. And as in all things Hollywood, everything always gets walked back, you know, especially then, I mean, given the constraints. But they worked on some other films, right?
Absolutely, you're absolutely correct, Melissa. And of course, I should have known, I knew I should have spoken to you this morning and tell you to not ask me questions like that, because I'm going to get this wrong. You're right. So they did movies together. If I'm not mistaken, Duke only did, you see me getting that crazy, I think Duke did 4, 5 scores, by the way, something like that, 4 or 5. The one you're thinking about, if I'm reading your mind correctly, you're thinking of Anatomy of a Murder.
Yeah.
Duke and Strayhorn. And I just spoke to a colleague of mine, Vincent Pillot, who's one of the great jazz historians, when we were talking about this. So of course, we all know that Duke did it and Strayhorn did Anatomy of a Murder, but I had overlooked the fact that neither one of them were particularly happy with the outcome. They'd written all this great music, but it was handed over to a music editor. And he only used a very small portion of it. And I'm not even sure what the percentage is, 20 minutes of what they actually wrote or something like that. So they weren't thrilled. And Duke apparently said to folks, okay, it was my first time out. There's some things, you know, some very strong opinions about how music should be used in film. I'm going to get it right, or I'm going to show them next time. And Paris Blues was that.
Anatomy of a Murder actually is one of those funny stories. That has one of the fastest start of shooting to screen time of any movie I know of. I believe it started shooting like in March of 1959. And it was in theaters by midsummer, which means that a lot of decisions must have been made very quickly and casually, and perhaps including the music.
And you have to dig also very deeply to find the Strayhorn's contribution to that, because the so-called hip websites on film don't mention Strayhorn. I had to read a book on scoring to find out his involvement in it. So that's, but he clearly was a power behind the musical throne on a lot of the scores that Ellington was involved with.
Which is a power behind the musical throne on everything. I mean, his I definitely recommend his biography if people haven't read it, by David Hadju. I believe the title of it is Lush Life, but he speculates and marshals a lot of, I think, strong evidence to suggest that Strayhorn knew exactly what he was doing. He was an out gay Black man in the 40s, 50s, and 60s on the jazz scene too, and was very clear that for me to live the kind of life I want to live, to be myself, to love who I want to love, I'm not going to be able to be the face or the front person. So If there's no Billy Strayhorn Orchestra or 40 records under my name, so be it. My music gets heard. As an artist, he was able to create things and have it performed. And Duke, and as far as I can read and see, Duke and all of the cats knew. Everybody knew Strayhorn was this bad dude. Everybody knew he was a cat, and so he made that deal with the devil, if you will, and chose being able to be who he was, be out, and live his life, love who he wanted. He sacrificed it for fame, and for the average person walking around not knowing who he was. I think it's an incredible. I think he's incredibly courageous, and obviously.
Did he spend because the story, and certainly the book deals a lot with people that moved to Europe or spent time in Europe because they felt like they had a lot more freedom. Was homosexuality accepted? I mean, musicians are musicians. Actually, you think about a classic jazz musician, you think about a very heterosexual male, nasty man, just saying. Was it accepted in the States in the same way? The homosexuality, within the jazz community?
I can't speak definitively about this, but it's very clear that Strayhorn was out. And so let me back up. I'll speculate. I'll put on a social researcher hat. I suspect the jazz community, like Paris, was a little further left, than the general population. But within the jazz community, of course, you have, we still struggle with rampant sexism in the jazz community, and that pigeonholing, in this instance, women performers, composers, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm sure there was all kinds of homophobia that went on. But what is clear is that Strayhorn was out, and I've never read anyone bad-mouthing him, either his performances or writing. There weren't people who would say, I'm not going to play this because it's by this gay man. But what did happen is that, Billy Strayhorn's not this gigantic star that he could and should be. I mean, the example I use for folks, anybody who knows music, the music, chords, the sound, and then the lyrics of the song Lush Life. When I found out as an adult that he wrote it when he was in high school, he was like 15, I think he was turning 16 in Pittsburgh. I'm like, wait a minute, because the lyrics are just so deep and world weary. You know what I mean? So I think the jazz community was a little bit better. I think artists, as they often do, lead the way on a lot of things, but I'm sure it was still, not paradise for him. And if I may speculate, I think the film suggests that Paris was the same way. That opening scene it's both deep and laughable, right? I mean, the way they portray a jazz club. On the one hand, it's this beautifully mixed crowd of all kinds of folks. On the other hand, there's this sort of craziness to it, the woman who's bobbing her head as if she's on amphetamines, and oh my God, two men kissing, and two women,
Yeah, which is implied, and that is actually it's the opening of the book as well. Opens with a sort of a pan across the scene, with all of these people. And I can remember seeing the film a while ago I just watching it with a less critical eye and feeling really, really cringy. And then also just even watching my dad be a hipster trombone player. I had this feeling. I was like, Dad, like when your dad dances, you're like, Dad, cut it out. I had a little bit of that, but honestly, yes, it portrays something really, really beautiful. And when I watched it with a more open mind and more recently, what it's trying to say is something really amazing. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly too, because there's some judgment passed in the book in that opening couple of pages too. It's a little bit of everything, but the hipster and the woman, I just wanted to ask you, like the woman scatting. So she starts out completely out of time, and I think they must have recorded it and then tried to insert it into the music, because she ends up in the right place, but her timing must have been different. I don't know who that. I'd be really curious to know who that was.
She plays Marie. You know, it's funny because that's funny you caught that. Maybe Max or Gary.
Is that Marie singing in the beginning of the film? Is that her? Yeah.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not like she can't. It's not like she's not doing it. It's just that her timing is completely off in the beginning.
Well, Melissa, funny that. See, I
have some technical questions for both of you.
Well, wait, we have technical questions for you because I see at first, Melissa, I thought the same thing. At first I thought my YouTube was out of sync. And then as it pans over the crowd, it's like, oh no, wait, the other people are sort of nodding their heads in sync. Well, so what's going on with her? So I played it back. And I think it's her singing. I don't think they went back and fixed it. I think she's just totally out of time. And then she catches up, you know, she sort of locks in near the end of the phrase. I think it's an 8-bar phrase or whatever it is.
I mean, there's out of time that works and seems intentional, but there's a line that I think might have been crossed.
In her defense, doesn't she sing later in the film? She does she sings a little bit with the piano. She sounds really good to me.
She's supposed to not be in the book. She's supposed to not be a great singer, I think, in the book.
Here's the thing, and a lot of people aren't aware that when you see a musical film, they're singing to a playback recording and they're playing instruments to a playback recording, music and song that has already been pre-recorded. I would be curious to know. So this may be a case where that just wasn't done well. And then from a performing and a playback question I had for both of you, that wonderful jam scene when the Armstrong character shows up unexpectedly, that's being performed to playback music that's already been recorded. I presume that's Louis Armstrong, that he's playing back to his own recording, or was there somebody else on the trumpet there?
No, that's Louis Armstrong. I mean, if that's not Louis Armstrong, that's someone who copied him down, and which isn't the easiest thing in the world to do. I mean, he was a magnificent trumpet player. I mean, just as an instrumentalist, and the command he had of the horn, his sound, the ability to play high, and deceptively so, to make it sound to our ears like, oh, I know that's high, but that's really sounds great. For a trumpet player to come along and just hit the same note right after him, it's very difficult. I mean, this is not very easy at all, and that's why. Rare, by the 60s it was better, but certainly in the 20s and 30s and 40s, it was rare for classical musicians to really respect jazz artists. And Louis Armstrong was one of the few internationally who had the respect of a lot of classical composers and musicians because of his command of the instrument. It just and his ability to improvise so melodically and with such a feel that, as Melissa's rightly saying, sometimes was against the beat, sometimes was with the beat, sometimes it's inside of it. He's swinging the entire time. That's him playing it, not in that, not on a sound stage. He's just, and there are times when he takes the trumpet away from his mouth a little quicker, than sound is. If you're a real jazz nerd and you're watching stuff like that, you can see it. But no, he's playing back to a track of himself at that point. Strayhorn and Ellington wrote a lot of music for this. They did some things in Paris, and then once the film was complete, they went back into a studio in New York and recorded the music that the characters are listening to in the film. So the title track, Paris Blues, which you hear when Melissa, that scene when your mom, she asked him, she wants to hear the Paris Blues, and he says, oh, you'll hear it when it's finished. Mm-hmm. Something like, I want to hear it, let me hear what's of it, and he puts the record on. They recorded that in New York.
Right.
But other things they would record, what we would consider to be a backing track, it looks like it was recorded in Hollywood and in New York, but they had some things recorded there in Paris that wouldn't make the soundtrack necessarily.
And as a performer and as a historian of jazz, how would both of you rate the acting by the musicians? Because I know musicians tend to cringe when they see musicians in movies they're supposed to be playing a piano or a sax and it just doesn't feel real. How would you rate how the actors did in Paris Blues?
Well, we had talked about this, about the fact that my dad was a really, before we go on too, I just want to clarify too that playing around the beat is something that people do. Like, not, you don't want, people aren't right on the beat sometimes when they're playing and singing. but in that particular instance, it just seemed a little out there. So yeah, my dad was a real workhorse, and when he needed to learn something for, he was the guy who was always, well, both my parents, but he was always ready. He knew his lines. He was ready for the job, and he did his homework. And I think he really, really did his homework. Learning just enough about how to play the trombone that it was convincing. And Wayne, you pointed out that you found it actually pretty convincing, that you were impressed. That made me feel good.
Yeah, he did a very good job.
Yeah.
The music not supervisor, a music consultant on the film was Billy Byers, a very fine musician himself and composer. And I'm pretty certain he was the coach for Paul Newman. Now, Sidney Poitier, for me, and I love and worship Mr. Poitier. I've had the opportunity to really, have a conversation with him, and it was thrilling. I think he's terrible in miming, not in his role. In his his acting in the film is great, but in miming a tenor player. Paul Gonsalves, by the way, who's in the Ellington Band, and people know from the famous 1957 Live at Newport concert, Diminuendo and Crescendo in Blue, the famous 64 choruses of the blues that sent the crowd into a frenzy, and was written about, and harkened the rebirth of the Ellington Orchestra, in the 50s after a little down period. Paul Gonsalves is the saxophone player who's subbing, who's playing you here when Sidney Poitier is miming. That doesn't work for me. But Paul Newman, aside from, if it were me, I'd have him move his body a little more, but apparently he was very conscious about not doing that. His movements of sliding and trombone are really on it, really fit. And what he's doing with his face and jaws, to the point that there was a point, I assumed he must have taken trombone lessons at some point. And Melissa, you have to tell the story.
Oh, God.
Even though it's more of I can't believe you got this.
All right, I'm outing myself. This is a terrible, terrible story. Well, I'll preface it by something else. This is why I'm here, because I'm the DNA in the petri dish. That's my expertise being here. First of all, I just wanted to say that I do remember when I was really little, being at a party and hiding under a table, which is where I generally was during a big party, which I wish I could do now, but it just looks funny when you're an adult. But when you're a child, you can hide under a table. And I remember seeing these shoes walk by and peeking out from under the tablecloth and remembering that it was Sidney Poitier, who was kind of unforgettable. And that's a pretty cool memory. Okay, this is a terrible story. When we were teenagers, in the house where I am right now, which is the house that I grew up in, my parents bought this house in 1961, the year I was born, right around the time that this movie came out. But we found a trombone in a trombone case under a bed in a guest room, and we thought, well, this is stupid. Nobody in the family plays a trombone. Why would anybody want this? And I think we hawked it. And I would like to die right now when I think about that. I mean, just like, we were dreadful children. I got my comeuppance. I raised two of my own. So this house has seen a lot of action, but that was one of my sorrier moments. And yeah, I mean, if anybody, I don't know. I mean, the thing is, like, it left without its provenance, which is heartbreaking. Like, it's just some random trombone just floating around the world. Hopefully I don't know. Hopefully some person ended up with it, and it went on to have a long and happy life. But yeah, ashamed of that.
Well, I mentioned, I just want to jump back in, Max, and say that like I say, I thought Paul Newman, I thought he looks great playing the trombone. The trombonist that's subbing for him is Murray McEachern, I think is how you say his name. He's kind of known in jazz circles, but not at all outside of that. He's mostly famous because he played in Benny Goodman's orchestra. And I'm pretty certain, again, my colleague Vince Pilotta, I hope he's on, I may shoot him a question.
He is, in fact.
I'm pretty certain he was on the Carnegie Hall concert that produced Sing, Sing, Sing. He's noteworthy to me because he's a very interesting guy, but I mean, had a wonderful career, studio stuff, really kind of another one of these crazy genius musicians. He played trombone and alto saxophone and played them both pretty well. And those are very, very different instruments, you know. So he was the sub for Paul Newman. And I read somewhere that, I know exactly where I read it, that Martin Ritt, the director, one of the few notes he gave to Ellington, one of the few things he sort of asked of Ellington was that he wanted Paul Newman's trombone sound to be high and sweet, smooth and melodic, like Tommy Dorsey. It doesn't say if he did the juxtaposition, as opposed to, you know, the trombonists that you have in your band, you know, who have a larger growler, more of a growling sound, more of a macho sound, more of a sound associated with, you know, black bands and jump bands coming out of Kansas City, you know, in the 20s and 30s. That juxtaposition isn't explicitly stated, but it seemed to be the implication. And Duke, of course, had incredible musicians. So any Lawrence Brown or Tricky Sam Nanton, any of those cats could have done the same thing. But apparently that's partly why he chose Murray McEachern. Interestingly, Murray would join the Ellington Orchestra for a couple of years. I'm not sure when, but after the you know, recording and filming of Paris Blues, he would in fact be in Ellington's orchestra. So there's again that sort of mixing, and I don't know if Martin was consciously trying to make sure that the music appealed to a broader audience than that, but that was one of the things he wanted. And the trombone playing is magnificent. I mean, that opening note of Take the A Train, that first really high note and the slide down, it's absolutely beautiful, absolutely beautiful.
Max, this might be a good time to show those photos, you know, the teasing that Newman endured.
We have some memorable behind the scenes gag photos from Paris Blues, and carefully posed, of course. Feel free to share whatever memories.
I actually took that off the wall in case you weren't able to find it. I believe those were taken by Herman Leonard, a photographer named Herman Leonard. I'm wondering if they were all taken by him or if there were probably a bunch of photographers there and if there are other versions of it. But it also is it's the same person who took the cover photo of Dexter Gordon that's on the paperback that I have, the original paperback. So that's kind of interesting, and that they chose to put Dexter Gordon on the paperback. Yeah, but this yes, there's the trombone. Shoot me. Yeah, I just think this is a brilliant. I think it's so funny.
Great stuff. Great stuff.
And my dad was kind of an Ohio punny, kind of a sense of humor guy, so I'm sure this almost seems like something he would have come up with, or maybe they came up with it on their own.
We're excited to find the photo, nonetheless.
Yeah, it's so good.
Herman Leonard is, you know, obviously a great photographer in that black and white, and the very famous photo of Dexter Gordon. The link to Dexter Gordon, of course, is that at the very beginning, you guys were talking about jazz films. I think the best film about jazz thus far is Round Midnight, without a doubt. And Dexter Gordon, of course, was a great jazz musician and nominated for an Oscar in that role.
Amazing.
And I believe his widow, Maxine Gordon, is joining us too on this. I believe Max is who's his biographer.
Can I show? I have it.
Oh,
there it is. That's the cover of the book.
Was that the original cover, or was that the reprint?
I think this is probably pretty original. It's a bit hard to find. It was a great read. It was really fun.
Yeah.
I'm glad I got it. Yeah.
And we're of course we're going to find out a little more about the novel. But for just watching the film without any knowledge of the novel, there's some envelope pushing going on. When Paul Newman is at the train station and he meets Diane Carroll, he's flirting with her. You know, is your roommate as pretty as you are? That was absolutely unheard of in a Hollywood movie in 1961. And then there's that little subplot with the Django Reinhardt type musician with a cocaine problem. Not only do we know it's cocaine, but we actually see him with cocaine on his hand. I mean, you just didn't see that in a Hollywood film. Of course, they pull their punches in other ways, but you know, for UA, at least, they sometimes went to the mat on a few things with regards to dealing with more adult issues. But I know Poitier was disappointed with the direction the narrative went when the couples were paired off racially instead of interracially.
But it's interesting that the original story is not an interracial story, and that the characters. And I mean, not to take too much, you know, away from the discussion of the book, but I did want to just read, because that can come later. But I just think it's interesting that one of the changes was describing Lillian, so the way that the characters changed, and describing Lillian, who turned into my mother. It says Lillian, her roommate, was in the lobby nervously pacing back and forth. She was a tall, gaunt woman, 60 years old. She wore her hair in a short, neat bob, that stayed, and her only concession to cosmetics was a faint suggestion of lipstick. So she was, that turned into my mom. Go figure. What quite a switch. But you know, there were a lot of interesting changes, and it's interesting to think about all of that.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read Melissa and I have talked about. We actually talked about this very early on, because Paris Blues, I really do like it. And my first exposure to the film was through the soundtrack, on the LP. Where I grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia, you could go and check out records from the local library. And my aunt was a librarian. She actually started the first library for Black folks in our town. She's kind of a local and statewide star, my late aunt. And so I spent a lot of time in the library, and I'd go check out records, and I checked out Paris Blues, because I think the original album cover had a trumpet on it, and we haven't talked too much about Louis Armstrong, but that was my first exposure to him. The music's great. And then later I saw the film, I want to say on one of those Saturday afternoons back in the late 60s and 70s, back in the 70s, I guess, when local stations would play classic film, and I thought it was phenomenal, Maxine just texted me the actual original cover, and it's a saxophone and a clarinet. But so I'm coming at it that way. I hadn't read the novel, and of course now I want to. I think they actually, again, I think it could have been really great, but I think it's pretty good, and they grapple with some pretty heavy issues. The whole conversation between Diane Carroll and Sidney Poitier about, staying and fighting, making an investment here in this country and leaving, is one that certainly resonates, I think, in the African American community, but I dare say in other communities. It's what I've thought about when I say, like, wait, how is someone why are you struggling with the Catholic Church over that? Why don't you just convert to something else, Or more recently, as our politics have gotten problematic for a lot of folks. I've had friends who said, I'm out of here, I'm gone, and I've said, well, wait a minute, what about those of us who want to stay and fight? There's an investment. So I love that tension, that conversation, and then simultaneously, Melissa, you got this conversation between your parents around, the sort of, to some degree, selfish, self-centered artist who is single-minded in purpose, very clear, committed, has this lifelong goal, and a bigger, maybe not a societal question, but certainly the question of, do I have room to let another person in? Do I love another person enough to sacrifice something for them? That's an ongoing question, I think. And I think they do a pretty decent job of juxtaposing them. Paul Newman is kind of a jerk at times in the film and really kind of self-absorbed, but there are no real bad guys in a way in the film. And I thought they did a good job of at least touching on You know, Sidney Poitier is clear about why should I go back there and go through that crap. Here, I'm treated like a man, you know. And Diane Carroll's like, no, you need to come back and fight for this, you know. And Paul Newman's like, I want to do this. I got to do this alone. And your mom is like, no, create space. There's nothing. What we have right here is special, and you're throwing it away. Man, I love that. I that's art to me, you know.
Yeah,
You know?
they really addressed so much there. We had an interesting discussion. Max felt that he was convinced, and you may have watched it again, but he was really convinced. He was convinced that Sidney Poitier didn't follow through and go with her later. He said, "I will follow. I have some things to tie up here, and I will follow through later, and I will meet you in the States."
Listen,
I was being protective of Eddie. I was being protective.
And we were like, no. He's in love with her. He's definitely going. And the thing is, it's such a different message in the film, because it was interesting that I was in a way I was kind of resenting the Diane Carroll character for asking him to give up his work to go back and deal with the garbage that was, you know, that he would have to, you know, why is it his job to rectify a situation if people are just going to be stupid and not, you know, but yeah, it's a very different movie. If he goes and if he stays, that's a really different message at the end of the film.
Listen, it's not just that Max doesn't just, he's not just like, oh, I don't think he does. Max was like, there's no way Sidney Poitier.
Did I say that? I don't remember.
Why would he ever go?
Did you watch it again? Do you agree with us now? He was in love with her. He does.
Okay, I've given this a lot of thought.
What does everybody think? That's what I want to know. What does everybody
I've given this a lot of thought, and I'm willing to concede that he is going to join her in the States. But I think there's going to be a terrible argument in about a year when he's saying, I miss Paris, I miss jazz, I think we need to go back. And she's going to say, hey, but this is our home. And he said, but yes, but you promised. And he said, I said no such thing. I can see that argument, you know?
Yeah, she says, we'll check back in a year. And then if you want to go back,
yeah,
go back.
I would have gotten it in writing. But it makes her compelling.
I have to say, I think he goes back. The two kisses did it for me.
No, I agree.
At the end of the train station, you know, the romantic in me wants.
The way he says "I love you," how the way he enunciates that so beautifully somehow, that he sells me. He sells me with that.
It's so Sidney Poitier. And then the scene with my mother where she just I love that wonderful, like, I'm the best you'll ever have. This, you know, however many weeks in Paris, and tears in her eyes.
They have some great lines where he says to her, Paul Newman, I'm not on the market. And she says, I wasn't shopping. You know,
shopping.
She's a baller. I like her. I like that character. I like the character that they made her into. I mean, it's
too, Melissa. I do. I think it's deceptive. I think people kind of want to dismiss her. She's complex, and she's got some quick, snappy comeback, and she knows who she is. She's not trying to be somebody else. I wasn't shopping, you know. He says, "What? You have friends over?" And she says, "All kinds."
All kinds. And then I said, yes, she's the kind of woman who has, you know, so she's a widow. She has 2 children. She has all kinds of friends over, and she has that piece of lingerie. Woo! Yes, she has all kinds of friends. Like, I'm never gonna forget that bustier. That bustier was like another star of the movie. And
none of us were going to bring that up. We're glad you did. That's your mom.
Oh my God, was she stunning? You know.
But you really get a sense of the chemistry between your parents in their scenes together.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah,
That's
agree.
what I'm always watching for, is that little zing where they're both going like, "It's not just a movie," you know. And
well, in fact, weren't all 4 of them in love, Sidney Poitier and Diane Carroll at that point?
Right, for years, right?
Oh yeah, that went on for years.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of interesting. It seems like another decision by the studios or perhaps the director. The kiss at the end, the kisses are passionate, seem to be, but the real heat and physicality is between Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward. They, you know, Sidney Poitier and Diane Carroll don't take any clothes off. You know, they don't make out. Other than there's a scene with the Frenchman who walks on them right under a little the where it's an outdoor scene, right? Are they on the street?
Continue. Yeah, they're in
Yeah,
a
continue.
gazebo.
That's
Yeah,
right.
we were saying that, you know, in light of modern sensibility, that that it seems charming at first watch, and then you realize like it's actually a little creepy.
Well, that's your 2020 eyes. That's your 2020
yeah, 2020 vision, right?
Yeah, but the real, and I just wonder if that was again, you know, the Hollywood censors and Hollywood marketers were very concerned about the Southern market, which one of you all was telling me.
Yeah,
Never
it would be, we were talking, I mean, a dream trip is to go to Paris, but a real dream trip is go to the United Artists Archives in Madison, Wisconsin, where they have all the memoranda on this film and the letters going back between the censors and the studio about what you can and can't do. And it would be interesting to see what they had to water down. Now, I was just for another presentation looking today at a clip from Carmen Jones from 1954, where there's passionate making out between Harry Belafonte and Dorothy Dandridge.
Yeah.
So they could do it, but there was seemed to be a conscious decision here to scale it back a little bit.
Yeah.
With regards to Sidney's character.
And again, I wonder how the director wasn't Otto Preminger in love with
Yes.
Weren't they involved during the filming of that? Yeah.
They were involved. Whether it was love on her part, I don't know, but he could have, you know, used his directorial advantages, unfortunately. But Preminger was always pushing the envelope with the censors. Maybe Ritt was being a little more cautious here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this might be a good time for us to bring in Nicole Flender now, and for another perspective on the book itself and her personal history of it and take on it. Is Nicole out there?
And Nicole Flender, by the way, is the daughter of the author Harold Flender, who wrote Paris Blues. Yeah. Nicole, welcome.
Thank you. And here I do have a copy of the book if you want to see what.
That's the original.
The original hardcover.
The original.
Wow.
With my dad on the back.
Oh, it is.
In Paris. Picture was taken, I think, at the De Magot in Paris. Anyway, my father was ahead of his time, and he wrote this book, I guess having been in Paris and seen Black jazz musicians in Paris. So he wrote it from the point of view of the Black man, you know, what he feels, the racism in I guess, New York, the United States, you know, segregation, discrimination. And in the book, and Melissa, you mentioned that you had read the book, it's really the Black man that has the main part. You know, he's the protagonist with Connie, you know, and it's Eddie Cook. It's the same name, Eddie Cook and Connie, and they're really the, you know, the hero and heroine of the book.
Yeah.
The white man, I should say, his name is Benny Levine. Mm-hmm. And you're given to believe that he's, you know, a nice Jewish man who's come to Paris and is playing in Eddie Cook's band. It's Eddie Cook's band. And Lillian, as Melissa said, is a 60-year-old school teacher. And, you know, Benny kind of keeps company with her so that her friend, Connie, can be free to go out with Eddie. And that's the real romantic interest in the book. And my father had written the first screenplay, which they threw out. And he was very truthful to the book, you know, wanting it to be about, you know, about the Black musician and kind of a motif running through the book was, you know, persecution in America, segregation in America, Jim Crow laws in America. They even mentioned the word Jim Crow laws at one point in America. So that was a very important piece of the book. And then, you know, they changed the name of the white character to Ram Bowen and made him Paul Newman, you know, much different type than is in the book.
Right.
Why did they do that? Well, you've mentioned that, I think Wayne mentioned that certain things were maybe ahead of their time in 1961, that the studios portrayed certain things that were a little ahead of their time, but the studio was not ready to portray the black man as the hero of the movie, with a white man, certainly not Paul Newman, being a secondary character to him.
Wow.
And they were looking, they were, you mentioned southern markets, they were looking at southern markets, they were looking to sell it in southern markets, and that would just not have flown.
Can I just mention that my mother, whenever she mentioned the film, she would always mention the fact that they had trouble showing it south of the Mason-Dixon line because she embraces Sidney Poitier, or there was some, because there was some interaction between them, and interactions that they had trouble showing it down south. I also wanted to ask, did your dad get any grief for writing, or any response for writing as, in the character of a black man? Is that something that had really been done before, or was there any?
I don't know if it had been done before, in this way, to kind of like a precursor to Black Lives Matter, let's say. But he didn't get any grief. It was a book, it had a publisher, it was published, and then I'm sure that it, wasn't doing fantastically well in the southern markets, but, it was even translated into French. There's a French book. But that's really, that's the, the crucial difference between the, the book and the movie. My mother always said, my mother, who's still alive, she's 93 years old, she always says, they switch those characters. They just switch those characters.
I always thought it was fascinating. I remember my dad working on trying to write a screenplay for the book, The Homesman, and he changed everything. And I remember asking him and saying, like, Dad, why don't you just write a book from the start? Like, you could do this. You could come up. It's like he needed a jumping off place. And then he took everything and he switched it all around. But I would just imagine that would just be so maddening as a writer. I mean, I know it happens all the time, but it was such a huge, I mean, I'm glad that the two black characters end up in there and are a big part of things, but it is pretty funny to think that
an arc.
Where Lillian started and where Ramboan started from those other two characters.
And again, the sort of only negative, I mean, with Sidney Poitier, always, those were the days when, a black man, a black star had to be perfect, and sort of above reproach and everything, from Guess Who's Coming to Dinner or any of the movies that he made, but I don't know how many versions of the script floated around, but one of the things that just came up, which I noticed it, but I didn't make a note of it at the time. The opening scene, right, with the jazz is sort of jazz, right, with all of the folks look crazy. There are all these different couples. It's very interracial. I haven't figured out if there's a shot of a woman. There's a young man sort of grooving to the music, and he wants to, and the woman puts her hand over his hand, and he kind of rises up. And at first I thought there were a couple. Then it occurred to me that maybe that's her son. She's trying to keep her son from getting just taken over by this crazy music,
I thought it was her son, and then I thought they were a couple. That's really
funny. You can't tell, right? But here's the thing. The rest of the club scenes, the patrons are almost all white. Like all white. There's nothing like the sort of wild-eyed vibe that goes on the first time around. You can explain it away a couple of, it's a cabaret. I love that club, by the way it looks like it's an old wine cellar or something. I bet the acoustics are killer in there. But that was a very interesting thing that clearly got muted, and so there are all of these choices that are made artistically. I've become I'm very forgiving of artists, because I think artists have to follow their vision, whether they're filmmakers, writers, singers, and then there's the commerce side, right? And the commerce side does what it does. They're saying to Louis Armstrong, okay, technology limits us. You got 3.5 minutes, Mr. Armstrong, make us dance, say something, And then later, oh, wait a minute, we've got 43 minutes. We got a little under an hour for this album, Mr. Davis or Miss Fitzgerald, thrill us, And now, technology allows us to film an entire concert. So, okay, Ms. Beyonce, you've got this technology before you work with it, And so there's always, I think, a push-pull artistically between what the artists and the creators are trying to do and what commerce is dictating. So I'm a little forgiving. You got a novel, they can't get all the complexity. It's why I like just the little one-liners that they have, like, oh, that's kind of interesting that they said that. It would have been nice if there was a whole conversation about it, even when, so Paul Newman's character is completely devastated by the response of this highbrow person, and it's kind of interesting, right, that Louis Armstrong, Wildman Moore, has to broker the meeting. He has to get, I think his name is Rene, he has to get this man to even look at Paul Newman's score, right? So he looks at it, he gives him this feedback, which is actually very kind of interesting feedback, and is another juxtaposition of jazz versus classical, what's considered highbrow versus lowbrow, the respect that jazz didn't have even among some of the purveyors of the art, right? So he gets this feedback, he's completely devastated. He has a conversation with the Django Reinhardt character, the gypsy. And he says, man, who cares what that, basically, he's like, well, who cares what that guy thinks? He doesn't know anything, your music is great. He doesn't know music. And Paul Newman's character says, he knows.
Yeah.
It would have been nice if that had been a longer conversation, but that's kind of like, that's an interesting exchange, well, whichever side you come down on, or if you don't agree with it. And so for me, it's like, I can imagine the producers saying, dude, this script is 800 pages long. Sorry, you got to cut the 300,
There's also, in terms of the art and commerce too, Harold Flender discusses the idea of Wildman Moore being really a sellout and like, on the verging on like minstrelsy, like that he's a brilliant musician, but that he's just mugging and like sort of an Uncle Tom character. That's a really interesting thing that doesn't make it as much into the movie, although it is, the amount of respect that Louis Armstrong gets in the film is a revelation. It's nice that, again, like of white musicians coming to a Black musician who is at a higher level than he is, who is more respected, and so on. So that's a great dynamic.
Listen, I think that's a great point, because there's a parallel, of course, right, between Wildman Moore's character and Armstrong's character in real life, and some of the criticism that he received, particularly from younger musicians. Particularly, it's 1960, 61, Black Power movement was just about to hit, and younger folks were not having it. They didn't like, what is all this mugging? What is it with you and this white handkerchief, man? What is the deal? Younger musicians, and there's that natural tension between generations, but and I always say it's very hard, for having been a young person, centuries ago myself, it's very hard to really understand the fullness of our elders' lives. It's very easy to dismiss them for the obvious things we see. Now, of course, Armstrong is recognized. Even the folks who would still complain about the mugging and the scenes I have seen where I still cringe or don't like it, you have to not balance. You have to juxtapose that to his greatness, to the respect he had.
We were talking about Hattie McDaniel saying, why should I, even though she got so much grief for playing maids, why shouldn't I take $700 a week for making a maid, for playing a maid in a film, instead of, $7 a week for being one?
Being an actor.
Let's be realistic. And the other thing I wanted to point out too was that in the clubs that I go to in the city, all of the jazz clubs, ones that I've gone to for years and years, I've noticed that in the beginning, when the cover charges were lower, it was people from the neighborhood, it was a bunch of people, there was a much more racial mixing in the audiences, and these clubs have to survive, and as the cover charges went up and the night got more expensive, it's mostly white people, it's a lot of tourists, a lot of Europeans, and a lot of people from Japan, a lot of people, that are coming from other countries, but the people from the neighborhood fell away, and the audiences got a lot whiter. And that was, it's a struggle. It's realistic. And while I'm saying that, I just want to point out to anybody that is a jazz fan that is listening, that right now, all of these clubs are struggling. These musicians are struggling. It is really desperately hard times for this music. And that live streaming is something you can do to help keep the music alive. So all of these clubs like Smoke and the Village Vanguard and Dizzy's is now live streaming. It's incredibly fun. Get on there, you know, pay your $10 or $20, and then graciously tip the band, because these people really need the money and they are making phenomenal music. So that's my plug for jazz musicians right now. You know, they need you. And you can literally be in a jazz club. You could be in like Mesro or Smalls while you're making your dinner and washing your dishes and hearing the best musicians in the world live in your kitchen, which is what my husband and I do. Every Saturday, we live stream jazz for our friends. And last night we actually were live streaming.
Rennie, did you do Rennie from the Vanguard?
No, we did Ethan Iverson, an amazing bass player from Mesro. And we turned the lights out in the kitchen, and we lit a candle and we pretended we were in the club, and it was fabulous. So I'm just saying, please, everybody, try that. It's so fun. All right. So
That's important. Well, you both hit on the whole art versus commerce thing, and the areas of commercial filmmaking that seem to get the least respect. You've got how the actors are treated, you have how the screenwriters are treated, and you have how the musicians are treated, because at least as far as Hollywood concerned, music is something that you add during the final editing mix before the print is being locked in 4 days. So composers are often not given enough time to really do their brilliance. And I can imagine how frustrating it must have been for Ellington and Strayhorn and so many others who just a fraction of what they compose gets to the screen, because it's all, they're never given the right amount of time anyway to do their art, I feel, the musicians.
Well, Duke was very clear about what the music, Duke was very clear about what I've read, following the experience with Anatomy of a Murder in particular. He was very clear about here's where this kind of music should be. Here's where this kind should be. Here's where the music should take precedence. You know, so he had a very, very strong conception of how he wanted to approach scoring this particular film. It would have been great if he'd had more opportunities, you know, but you see, you know, you see his children, if you will, you see their work in film in that period going forward. So, and, you know, again, in Paris, you know, you've got Quincy Jones really starts to rise up, Benny Carter being a contemporary of Louis Armstrong and scoring for television a lot and mentoring Quincy Jones. I mentioned to you guys that Ellington goes into the studio to record the actual track Paris Blues. They recorded after the film was completed, if I'm not mistaken. And in a funny little aside, you know how at the very beginning they're talking about, you know, that's a beautiful melody. It's a little heavy. I'm gonna write it for oboe. I'm gonna arrange it. I'm gonna score it for oboe. And Paul Newman's like, oboe. Right. Ellington and Strayhorn actually did use an oboist and do have the melody of Paris Blues played by an oboist when they went back into the studio and recorded it. But in terms of film scoring, in that band, in addition to Johnny Hodges, the great alto saxophone player who played with Ellington forever and ever, 43 years or so, to the time of his death, the other saxophone player is Oliver Nelson, whom people won't know.
Last Tango in Paris.
Exactly. One of the great film composers behind the scenes, great jazz arranger. A year later, Oliver Nelson would record his best-known album called Blues in the Abstract Truth. I encourage you to check it out if you get a chance. You will recognize the track Stolen Moments, but he would go on to score for all kinds of television shows and movies. And he's playing second alto and tenor in Duke Ellington's band for the scoring of the movie. He wasn't touring with Duke. He just did that particular session. So I think the lessons that Duke learned sort of filtered their way into what we would eventually hear, even though he didn't have that many opportunities to score film. And I think it would have been great if he had.
Well, Wayne, it's a 75-minute mark here. I guess we should probably go to questions now, because I think we're going to have a few from the various texting I hear about one point or another with the film.
But thank all three of you for, you know, of course, our two main guests, and also Nicole.
Can I tell you a quick factoid I just learned while you're pulling people in, a real quick one? So the photographer, Herman Leonard, that Dexter Gordon connection. And then I think the film Around Midnight is the best jazz film. You guys should do a thing on that.
Spike Lee disagrees, I guess.
What's the best jazz film? What does Spike think the best jazz?
Yeah, he doesn't like it at all. He really slammed it at one point.
Listen, Spike's a good friend of mine. We have our listen. By the way, I'm doing a conversation Thursday night. Big plug online with Terrence Blanchard, who scored most of Spike Lee's films. Terrence is a good friend. We're doing it for. You can find it on Facebook somewhere. The factoid is Paul Newman won an Oscar the year that Dexter Gordon was nominated for an Oscar for Around Midnight.
That's right.
It was The Color of Money was Newman's
Look at you, Lissa. Did you know that?
I didn't.
I stumped you. I love that.
And your dad wasn't there to receive his Oscar, Melissa. He was somewhere else. Maybe directing The Glass Man.
Probably racing, actually. Knowing him, like he would miss that for a car race.
There was a story there. There was supposed to be a tribute to your father, Melissa, on the Oscars that year, knowing that he was going to win. And Betty Davis didn't follow script, and she was so busy praising her co-presenter, Robert Wise, that they didn't get to run the Newman tribute.
I think my dad would have rather have won for The Verdict. And I know that he won the Lifetime Achievement Award because they were so afraid he was, they weren't going to end up giving him any Academy Award before he passed away. So he won the Lifetime Achievement Award, which he referred to as the Dead Man's Award.
That was the year before, I believe, and he was beamed in from the set of The Color of Money, I think.
I think they were just afraid they were going to what if something happens to him? And we've never given him an Academy Award. So
that's the one I'm thinking of. Then it was the year before, because there was supposed to be a video clip segment of his work, and they didn't get to show it.
And I just have to say two more things. One of them is, I just popped into my head, was that in the book, Connie is not even a jazz fan. There's nothing that implies that she cares anything about music. How could they be a couple? I don't get it. And the other thing I'm going to say is that one of my first Barbie dolls that I ever had was my Julia Barbie doll, which was Dr. Carol.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, this is actually, I'm going to cut everybody off because that's a great segue to somebody who has their hand raised. And Susanna, would you unmute yourself and turn on your video and introduce yourself if you don't mind.
I think we know what's coming here.
Hi.
Hi. Oh my God, that's Diane Carroll's daughter.
Yeah, it is. Hi, Melissa.
I'm betting that you and I went to a birthday party together at some point.
Are you friends with Gina Belfanti? Anyway, I feel like someone's tried to put us together before. But this has been really interesting and fun to listen to. By the way, I'm pretty sure that old woman who puts her hand on that young man's arm, that's her boy toy. I'm betting on that.
It's gotta be the boy toy.
That's the boy toy. And if you think about all the other envelopes they were pushing, that's her boy toy.
Yeah.
You guys, you got to introduce. Suzanne Kay is Diane Carroll's daughter, but she's a producer, a writer. She's done documentary films. We've never met. But
no, I'm so happy to meet you. It's funny because I didn't realize, first of all, that the white characters and the black characters were reversed in the book. So that's really interesting.
Yeah.
But I watched it recently. I'm working on a documentary on Mom, and I watched it like a few months ago. And I looked at this, and this was my response, Wayne, which is different than yours. Yes, they had to get those social justice points out there, and it was revolutionary that they did. But as a result, those two characters didn't get to be complex love story characters at all. I watched that and I thought, there we are again, having to represent.
Right. Oh, I got
something political, right? But we don't get to show the levels, the intricacies of who we are as human beings. Right. And so my mother's role, her acting was like, you must come, she's like a school marm, you must come to America and defend your people. And, your mom gets to be like complicated and sexy and and a really intricate kind of many-leveled love story, which I enjoyed much more than the that had to be done by the black parents.
In the book, the black couple have a very intricate love story.
And now I'm realizing that. And of course, it was Hollywood.
The white couple aren't even a couple. The white, it's like he's kind of babysitting her so that Connie and Eddie can go off and do their thing.
Right. All that gone. And we go to the very cardboard characters that, as you said, Sydney always had to play that kind of I'm perfect. so that he could be
And
accepted
your mom
by
too.
white
Suzanne, listen, so here's the thing about this. So tell me what you think. I think you're 2,000% correct, by the way. I think you're absolutely correct. But I'm thinking about, like, if my parents saw it. My parents loved your mom. Well, all of us, Thursday nights, Black America, 100% across the country, watching Julia, right?
Right.
And your mom.
And Melissa had the Julia doll.
Right, which I love, right? Her first one. But my parents watching that movie, they would have loved it because the two of them were perfect. They didn't smoke, they didn't drink, they're not like feeling each other up in public. They're very respectful. You and I want the complexity, but I think at that time, even Black audiences were like, yeah, there's nothing you can say about us now. Look, they're perfect. Listen, I'm so jaded. I was happy that nobody Black in the film was a drug addict. You know what I mean? It was like, it's not cool that they made the gypsy, the drug addict, but still, it's like, whew, thank you.
Yeah, and that's why you can't take things out of historical context. You're right, and that was probably very important because there's so few roles that we had at the time. But as an actor, I imagine my mother was just, what did she have to chomp into? Not much, just representing that. But anyway.
What do you think of the scenes where Paul Newman is clearly flirting with her? Like, he's trying to hit on her.
Yeah, that would have been much more interesting. But of course, that would have been much more interesting. And it seems like Sydney wanted that too. Yeah. It is funny that both of them your parents were already a couple, married, right, at the time?
Yeah.
Right?
I believe.
Married. Right, because hopefully. And my parents,
they were.
My mom and dad were, I had just been born 3 weeks when my mother flew to Paris to do this.
Wow.
And so she gave me to my grandmother and she flew there. My mother and father were already kind of rocky because my mother had already had a spark with Sydney shooting Poor Game Bess in LA. And they had split up, my mom and dad, and then they come back together after things didn't work out with Sydney. And then they had me, my mom and dad. And then my mom gets this offer for a role in Paris to shoot a movie with the man that she'd had the thing for. My poor dad had to drive her to the airport. I just feel so sorry for my father.
Oh my.
Anyway, so there was a lot churning underneath the.
We need to talk.
That's a good story.
Listen, y'all should talk. Yeah, y'all got some. Yeah.
Well, Melissa and Suzanne, I think that talk can be on one of our future New Plaza Cinema. No. Okay, wait. Thank you for correcting me on that one. I got it. Maybe an edited version of it, but that's great. And thank you, Suzanne, for joining us. And if you don't mind hanging out, maybe some of our questioners might have a question for you as well. So I want to remind everybody that if they want to ask a question, they should hit the participant button and then raise your hand, and we'll start doing that. And so I'm going to ask Daniel to please unmute yourself. And you're ready to go, Daniel. Thank you.
I have a very simple personal reaction to this film. I'd seen it before, and I've been a jazz fan for decades. So what really struck me in this viewing of it is that it is, in my mind, essentially an ode to being in Paris and being in love. And what's essential is that you are in Paris with the person you're in love with. It doesn't always work out that way, but my favorite scenes were what I would call the interstitial scenes, where the couples are wandering Paris and doing what couples in love will do. And they were indeed wandering. They weren't walking with any destination in mind. And that's the real pleasure of being in love in Paris. And that's all I have to say. It worked for me on that level.
Wow. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Great.
While you're putting the next person up, let me just make one of the viewers has made a point that's extremely important, because I was the one who said it, that we really cannot just dismiss the fact that the portrayal of, it's a great actor, I think he's French, but the portrayal of the drug addict in the film is Aroma, someone, a gypsy. And the history of that, which is not as well known in this country as it should be, certainly wasn't as well known by me, shouldn't just be passed off with a laugh. So that she's absolutely 2,000% correct. And like I say, I was saying that I was glad that it wasn't a Black person. It shouldn't be ascribed to any stereotypical community or group of folks. So, and again, I mentioned it's clear he's clearly the Django Reinhardt character, who was an extremely important musician, extremely important figure in jazz, and played with Duke Ellington, just an historic figure. So that's a very important point. I just want to say, yes, you are right, and thank you for making that point, and my apologies for passing over that.
Another point connected to that is that in the book, he's actually a French-born Black man who ends up losing, having mental issues, which is also really interesting and a little bit more complex. And for them to fall back on this,
there's no drug problem. There's no drug problem.
There isn't a drug problem, right? He just has he has
shell, just like in the film, or he thinks that he needs to get a letter from Picasso, and he needs to get a letter from Cézanne, and he just goes off on these fantasies, and they go to a hospital, and they're just considering giving him shock treatments. So it goes off on that tangent, not at all on the drug tangent.
And actually, to Suzanne's point, there's actually a scene where Eddie and Connie go visit him he's in a mental hospital, and I think they go and visit him, and he's like, well, this isn't a very nice way to spend a date.
Right.
That's complexity right there. That's unusual. That would have been an interesting scene to play, right? Anyways.
Good. That's great. Thank you so much. And I'm going to ask Marjorie to please unmute yourself and start your video. Go ahead, Marjorie.
Hey, hi, thank you. I just want to say how much I've enjoyed this discussion so much about this movie, which the star of the movie, I think, is the jazz score. And I loved seeing, of course, the four principal characters. But other than that, I just found this movie to be one big cliche. The dialogue, the scenes, walking along the sun, the parfait, the croissants. And I love when the trailer said, "You feel like it's happening to you." Well, this has happened to everybody I know, including me, when they go on vacation and they meet somebody, they fall in love, then there's this correspondence or whatever. So I did find the movie to be, in that score, totally a cliche. A piece of trivia: when the movie came on and I noticed it said Penny Baker Productions, so I researched that because I knew that was Marlon Brando's production company. And what it said was that Brando was initially going to do the Paul Newman role, but surprise, surprise, he lost interest in it. So I don't know the truth of, to that. But on the point of whether he goes back with her, Sidney Poitier, absolutely not. To me, that was
I feel a little.
Absolutely, that was
Tell us more about this.
That was a kiss of definitely kiss me as if it were the last time.
Whoa.
Okay, when she goes off on that train, and his eyes are sad, and he's looking down. He knows he's not going back. He just really didn't want to confront her with it. I never got the slightest idea that he was going back. And another question I have is, at the end, the poster, that they're taking away the poster. It showed Louis Armstrong playing the trombone, and they were covering it over with a publishing company, LaRousse Publishing Company. And I was just wondering what significance that might have had, or if other people didn't notice that.
Well, it's been argued that the significance of that, so the film, at the beginning of the film, they're putting the poster up, and at the end of the film, they're taking it down. And Wild Man Moore and Louis Armstrong represent jazz, not the sort of established classical respected music. And again, the tension between what Ram wants to be and what he wants to do and where he is that classical versus jazz. That's symbolic of, okay, off with this trivial fun. Yeah, it's nice, but it's light. Off with this music, and now on with something serious. Because I believe the magazine is it covers canonical literature in France, if I'm not mistaken, or something very highbrow. And so it's been argued that that's another sort of symbolic gesture of that tension between the two and the superiority of this highbrow art form versus what the music that at least Louis Armstrong represents. And meanwhile, Paul Newman, of course, gazes up at it respectfully. He wants to be respected like Louis Armstrong is, while Moore in the film. It's one of the things that a lot of jazz folks, I have problems with it. Like I have problems with it, but again, I think it's one of the things that makes the film pretty good. In fact, there are a lot of musicians of a certain generation who are absolutely, totally respected, one or two giants even, who really wanted respect from the classical music world. Nina Simone, see the documentaries, read the books on her. She talks about it as if it were the day before. Not being admitted to, I believe it was Peabody. I don't think it was Curtis. I think it was the Peabody Conservatory. Devastating to her. And apparently to the day she died, she wanted to be respected as a classical pianist. And there are other folks. I don't particularly dig that. I think it's a completely different. I'm where the French actor, what is his name? Serge Reggiani. I apologize for getting his name wrong, because he apparently is a huge figure in Paris and among folks who follow that, and I should know better. But he says, he's so clear, like, dude, that's a different criteria. He doesn't get it, and I'm kind of like that. This is not, you don't need acceptance from that world for your genius to be known. If they get hip to it, cool, but they're late to the party, But his character is accurate in reflecting that desire, And again, it's 1961. There were no jazz studies programs in the country. Well, I'm old enough. I was born in late '59. I used to always hear the terms, do you play jazz or legit music? Right?
My godfather was John Lewis of the Modern Jazz Quartet. And
that's your godfather?
Yeah, and my dad managed them. And that speaks to exactly what you're talking about, because he brought jazz into that that dignified sector. And so they reached a wider audience as a result. He was always in a suit when he performed, and he made all of the guys dress impeccably. Right. And he was obviously classically trained as well. And so he helped elevate in people's eyes the gift, the artistry of jazz, because he did that. But you had to wear that suit.
Listen, I'm sorry to be jumping on you because you got me excited. You are when I say you're 2,000% correct, you are so on it. And there was that tension inside the MJQ, who I think someone coined the term chamber jazz, right? And they made great money, but there was a tension between Milt Jackson and John Lewis. They loved each other, I think, but Milt Jackson, the phrase he used to say was, "Man, I want to put some grease on it." And John always wants me to take the grease off.
I have to say, listening to, I was just listening to a presentation from Dizzy's last night. It was the Ella Fitzgerald tribute, so all of these amazing singers. And, you look at someone like Cecile McLaurin-Salvant she studied opera originally. And then Renee Fleming, who was also in it, sang, she was originally a jazz singer. I think that was her. And she recorded a jazz album with the understanding that you have to find a different voice. You can't sing it with your opera voice. I don't know that I think it was like 100%. She's such an amazing person, but that it was such that it was amazing, that it was super successful, but she understands that there's a different voice. And then they had Audra McDonald singing, who has a very operatic voice and uses it, for everything she does, because she does musicals. I don't know. It's just always interesting to see whether that works or it doesn't. And then you look at a lot of classical musicians who they are fascinated by this idea of improvisation. It's something that, and then it's also wonderful to listen to jazz musicians especially pianists, you noticed a lot, people that you can see the ones that they've really studied classical music heavily, and you can see it working its way into their music. It's just always very interesting. I don't see why it has to be an argument, but back then, yeah.
For a lot
And
of
we have, I'm going to interrupt just for a second. We have 6 more hands up, so I'd like to you just get 1 or 2 more. And I'm going to ask Vincent to please unmute yourself and turn your video on. I know a thing or two, Vincent.
The reason won't go on.
Okay, try your video now. There you go.
Got me?
Last frame.
Okay, there I am. All right, listen, I'm going to try to keep this short because I have a lot to say, but I don't want to throw it all out there. First of all, I'm not a great fan of the movie. It's an okay movie. I just think Hollywood has a hard time with jazz, and I don't think they'll ever really get it right. That's just the way I feel. But without getting into that, I'm going to go into my jazz nerd mode that Wayne knows so well. First of all, Murray McEachern was not on the Carnegie Hall concert. It was Vernon Brown and Red Ballard. But I just want to make sure everybody knows that. Also, Django Reinhardt was not a drug addict.
Right, let's be clear. That's right. That's
not all he did. He was not a druggie.
But Vinny, was Murray in the band? Was he in Benny's band? He was in the band in the 30s, though, right?
Well, it wasn't a real band. He recorded with Benny Carter a couple of times.
Oh, okay.
But it was never a real band, you know. But he did tour with Ellington briefly. That's true. Let me see. Also, I thought Sidney did a pretty decent job on the sax. But as I wrote in the comment, that you probably don't feel that way because you're a saxophone player yourself. You know? So just like the guitar player, I play guitar. I didn't think the guitar player was very good either because he was also singing. So the instruments that we know, of course, we're going to say he's not doing that right. So I think that's part of that. But I thought he did okay. He got the music ahead of time. He had the music before the film. So he was able to listen to the music and work out something, I guess. And Billy Byers did a great job with Paul Newman. He really looks like he's playing the trombone. He really good.
Yeah.
And also, Melissa, I want you to know that my wife is not a jazz fan. I've been married for 35 years, so it can work. Okay, it does work. All right. Also, something that nobody's pointed out in that film on drums is a character that they call Mustachio. His real name is Mustache. Actually, that's not his real name, but that's his stage name. He was a very famous French actor and a jazz drummer. His real name was Francois Alexander Galapidis. He was Greek. He was born in France, and he actually can play the drums. But I don't think he's playing on any of the soundtrack. It's other drummers. But he was a real actor and a drummer that people probably don't know anything about. And I guess that's about as nerdy as I'm
Wait a minute, Vinny. Okay, so wait, Vinny. Yes, because so they used 4 or 5 drummers. That was one of. Did you read the reviews of the movie by jazz critics? There's a downbeat review. They hated it, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sure
they complained about all of the drummers are great, but they're mad because it's not. You know, it wasn't. So wait now. The French actor is an actual drummer because he is terrible in terms of what he's doing on the set. Are you sure he's an actual drummer? Is that true?
Yeah. Yes, he really is. But I think
he's one of the great jazz historians right now, you guys. So seriously, he's who I go to check on stuff. Wow, because that guy is terrible.
Of a Dixieland drummer. I think he was more of a Dixieland jazz drummer. He wasn't really a modern jazz drummer. And he is mugging a little too much and doing stuff that doesn't really work. So
okay, I'm sorry, Vinny. 2 seconds. Just say a quick second about how popular Armstrong. Armstrong's one of the great. I mean, he's one of the great popular figures on the planet at this point in history, right?
Yes, by that time, of course, he was considered one of the man that made jazz what it was, because in 1920s when he hit the scene, 1923, nobody sounded like him. I mean, he had people like King Oliver and Freddie Keppard before him, but Armstrong had a sound that nobody else had, and he pretty much showed everybody how to swing. I mean, he was in Fletcher Henderson's orchestra in the 20s, and that orchestra sounded pretty sorry until Armstrong got in there and showed them how you're supposed to swing. And he just took off from there. And so by 1960s, he was pretty well established. And Wayne is right. There were those knuckleheads who thought that he was Uncle Tom and what crap. But really, he was still at the top of his powers that late in 1960, as you could hear on the soundtrack. He's blowing like you wouldn't believe. One of the things about the movie that I also didn't like was the fact that by 1960s, there was this sort of Afrocentric thread going through jazz circles. Like Randy Weston, for instance, was equating the African thing with jazz, and I thought that was kind of interesting that the black character in the movie didn't have any of that. To him, it was just jazz, and it was just, I'm just playing, and it was really the white character who was deeper as far as the jazz thing was concerned, and that was kind of annoying to me. But
I feel like that the way that the movies approach jazz and many things, it's almost like they got a foot dragging on the ground, like the foot on the brake. It's just a little bit behind the times with everything. So yeah,
That's one of the charms of cinema, usually about 20 years behind social issues. So why should jazz be any exception?
But this was wonderful. Melissa, nice to seeing you and met you over video. And Suzanne, hey, Diane Carroll, I was in love with her and Juliet when I was a kid. I'm still in love with her, actually.
I've never heard that before. Funny.
Well, Vincent, thank you so much for bringing that, and I guess I'll have to admit that too, and many people. Thanks so much. We're going to try and get through the rest of the questions. By the way, the just informally, our poll says that Eddie did not go back. So I think Max may be vindicated.
I have to stand up and do this thing here, but not so.
Nancy, would you please unmute yourself and turn on your video?
There you go. A couple of things. First of all, I just want to notice that Diane Cannon did not get screen credit the same way that Paul Newman, Sidney Poitier, and Joanne Woodward did. She got screen credit alongside of Satchmo.
Well, Diane Carroll, first of all, she was an up-and-coming star at that time. So because the other three were such major stars, they had more leeway for billing. That's why it was done that way.
And I also, this is just an aside, I love the idea of being able to make dinner and hear wonderful jazz.
Yeah.
So how do I do that? Where do I go? What do I do?
You just have to go to the sites for the clubs, and you pay for individual live streams. But if you do Smalls and Mesro, even though the visual quality is not that good, like I think you pay $10 and you have access to all of their live streams and all of their archives. It's unbelievable. It's like
and who is that, please?
If you look, there's a Smalls Foundation, SMALLS, Smalls Foundation. We do Smoke. Smoke is an amazing club that was kind of our living room before COVID.
I'll tell you what, why don't we put some information into our thank you note for everybody, and we'll send that out as we go. So I want to get through to the next couple of people real quickly. So please comments, questions quickly, and answers quickly as well. I want to get everybody as our tradition. So Joan, would you please unmute yourself and start your video?
There, I think I just did it. First of all, it was an absolutely unique and great discussion, which I loved. I was struck that it's like the theme of it is like it's sort of reprisal of The Red Shoes. It's another film about art versus life. At least that's Paul Newman's dilemma with Joanne Woodward's character. And I found that interesting. And in terms of, I did find that the ending, I knew that Paul Newman would not go back. It's sort of before the ending. And as far as Sidney Poitier leaving, I too felt that he wasn't going to do it, especially when he walks off with Paul Newman. Otherwise I would have been heartbroken if he'd left and gone back. I couldn't imagine why he would be that stupid.
Two words, Diane Carroll.
Diane Carroll, I don't know, that's a big...
Even she couldn't do it.
James Baldwin went back. Remember, he felt he had to go back to support the cause, but he left too. So Yeah.
Joan, thank you very much. I'm going to get to our next questioner.
Almost everyone comes back. Almost all of the cats came back.
Cheryl, would you please start your video and unmute yourself? And then we have one last after Cheryl. That will be Joyce. And then we'll switch over to Sean. Thank you, Cheryl.
Hi, how are you? I think I've seen this movie about 4 or 5 times, and just a few small points. One thing, I think that the actors, I've never seen any of them look better than they did in this movie. And perhaps it was a function of the age they were at the time, but they were all just stunning looking. I've been to Paris maybe 4 or 5 times, and I always go to the jazz clubs. And I just wanted to say that the jazz club in the movie, I thought it looked so authentic. It looks like jazz clubs that I've been to in Paris, which were, often in cellars. And I thought it was very authentic looking. And as you mentioned, one of the big points of tension in the movie is whether Eddie should come back to the United States. And I am always, every time I see the movie, I'm always rooting for him to stay in Paris. And as a speaker mentioned, I know that James Baldwin during the 60s, he did come back he was living in Paris. He came to participate in some of the civil rights marches. But he was, he was like a public moralist and a public intellectual. And I think he sort of felt an obligation to be involved in that way. But for a jazz musician for whom there were so many more opportunities, a Black jazz musician for whom there were so many more opportunities in Paris, I thought Eddie would have been crazy, to come back here, even for Diane Carroll.
Doesn't she have a line where she says something like, what I interpreted as, I don't know what the exact line is, but I interpreted as, everyone, there's someone oppressed everywhere. It's just one line, but to me, it was sort of pointing out like, yeah, you're cool here, but it's not like there aren't people who are oppressed here. And then the whole scene, right? So again, it's not a great movie because they don't go deep into it. But for me, that pointed out I love the tension, and I love it not being resolved. And I think people, I hear you. I just think the romantic in me wants them to go back, but seriously, there are tens of thousands of reasons for someone to go back. And there is a real question, unresolvable to some degree. Do you just pack up and leave? Should African Americans in this country just pack up and leave? Because, we've loved a country for centuries, it doesn't love us back. Or do we stay and fight?
I remember when I first went to Paris, I guess I was about 30, and it was the first time I ever felt like a person as opposed to feeling like a Black person. Yeah. And it was wonderful. And and I've been back to Paris a number of times, but one of the great regrets of my life is that right after college, I did not go there to live for a while. I think I would have enjoyed my youth in a way that I didn't enjoy it here if I had been in Paris.
So sure, may I ask you a tough question? Now, it won't be to you, but it'll be I'll ask it generally. So here's because this is one I've pondered too. Because by the way, I'm with you. I think particularly African Americans, but all folks would be considering living elsewhere. But let me ask this question. So if an African American goes and lives in Paris, do you then become an activist there on behalf of people who are not oppressed? Or do you become a model minority and who then gets used as a juxtaposition to those folks who won't behave? Because that's, I think, what happens to us in this country, right? Okay. The easiest example is with Black Americans who are from the Caribbean. The juxtaposition of, why can't you be like them? Well, we can't be like them. We're not immigrants, right? If we go to the Caribbean, we're the rock stars, right? And I don't have an answer for it, because I think at the end of the day, Eddie Cook has got to make his own personal difference.
Yeah.
Right?
I think everybody has to decide whether they want to be an activist or not. And whatever the choice is legitimate.
By the way, here's my answer for you, and I thought you would say it back to me. I thought you'd say, Wayne, are you kidding? I keep a flat in Paris and I still live in the States. Like, that's the answer, right? We gotta have these multiple locations where we can be our fullest selves.
Yeah.
I just think that the idea that, you know, a certain group of people is obliged to always represent, always represent, always represent. And then this, you know, this idea that, you know, you have a whole life apart from this struggle that's been thrust upon you. And, you know, that's a really interesting question. I mean, he's able to just be his other himself, his other life, his struggle, his art. I mean, his art, his true self. And I resented her actually when I was reading the book and watching the film for asking him to go back and participate in the struggle. And yet it's a really different, it's kind of a really different movie if he goes back or if he stays. It's kind of like the whole message of the movie is really different depending on what his decision is.
Yeah.
And there would be something hugely heroic about going back. And yet how exhausting to think that, I don't know how exhausting they think that it's still.
No, it is exhausting, but and I honestly, I'm honestly playing devil's advocate because it is an individual decision. And I think, so historically, particularly African Americans in this country have had to answer this question a couple of times. The whole migration, the Northern migration and the movement of blues from rural America to Chicago, right? There's the whole movement of this music we love called jazz. There's no surprise that it went from New Orleans to Jackson to get on the train in New Orleans north, and you're going to stop in Jackson and you're going to be in Chicago. Surprise, surprise, here we are, you know, New York. So it is a tension and a juxtaposition. And I think what someone like a Cheryl, for me, beautifully represents is I like us having the freedom to, the opportunity to go and just be free and experience being a human being, as to always having to be what someone else has labeled us here, you know. And I just think it's one of those natural tensions that we just have to struggle with.
You know, Wayne, to that point, because I was, and I'm going to name drop here, I was speaking to Mr. Belfonte about whether he felt this time was in some ways more dire than the 60s, in which he was so active and took such risks. And, you know, he was more horrified by what was going on now, which made me not able to sleep. And this was before this recent election, but it doesn't really matter. But, you know, he thought after, I spoke to him again about this, and he thought that there was perhaps more awakening going on in this term. You know, this is a whole other discussion, y'all. This is going on forever. But the term white allyship, you know, it'd be great if we didn't have to be representing all the time, but it's not on us to make that decision. Right. And so up to now, it has been left to us. So what has happened more recently is people have begun to see through things like voter suppression and mass incarceration that, oh boy, that actually messes up my agenda as well, my progressive agenda. If I'm white, that actually messes with my progressive agenda because there's a block of voters we need to get things done. And I'm seeing now how suppressing this part of the block actually impacts me. And so when that has changed people a little bit. This is the conversation I was having with him about this. So maybe now people will say, oh, racism isn't just their problem. It actually is impacting all of us. And to the degree to which they will then, you know, take this on their shoulders instead of it being on our shoulders. And if that happens, that'd be great, because then we can go to Paris and come back and be all that we are. And not have to have, you know, the election turned because Black women did what Black women just did recently. You know, it could be a more shared burden, would be wonderful. We're all for it. We're just waiting for you guys.
Yeah, I agree with, I saw something on YouTube that I'd like to share with everybody in the future, but maybe we have another type of conversation in the near future. That's wonderful points you were making. I do want to turn it over to our last person to ask a question, and that would be Joyce. And Joyce, your video's on, and please go.
Yes. Thank you. My question was, how did the character, I think Connie and Lillian, what was their backstory? I know that Lillian said she had 2 children, and they never said if she was divorced or a widow, but I kind of felt she was widowed. But how did the movie, which did not go for the Paul Newman, Diana Carroll couple, how could they have a Black woman and a white woman traveling together in 1960? What was the story about? How did they become friends enough to go on a vacation together? Wouldn't that have been looked at as something shocking at the time?
book, they're school teachers and they go on a school teacher tour. See,
Okay.
the teachers, that's in the
Well, that gives it a little backstory then. Thank you.
But I think that Connie is a teacher in the movie, and Lillian says that she works in a small business. So I guess they just know each other from the small town they're in.
Now, my question was, would they be allowed to travel together? I guess depending where they were, certainly not from the South. And my other question is this. Lillian curses Ram at the end. She says, "You'll never find anyone like me. You'll be seeing me everywhere you go." What do you think of that one?
That's just a broken-hearted woman.
Right. But she almost didn't cry. She
I'm
said,
betting my mother said that at some point to my father.
Oh, yeah?
You know what, Melissa, that's the line I actually thought was real. I remember watching that and thinking, I don't know why I thought that might have been real.
Yeah.
That was a great point, Joyce, I think.
Joyce, she uses the term, she says, "I'm going to give you a gift." And then she starts talking and she describes what you said. You described it as a curse, which I hadn't thought about that. I like that. Then she says, "Because that's the gift you gave me." And she's saying that all of the things I just said apply to me. I'll never meet anybody else like you. This was an incredible 12 days, blah, 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 blah. Like, I see it as a gift. She's going to marry there's a farmer back in her town who's in love with her. He's a nice guy. His wife passed away 2 years ago. They're going to get married. It'll be fine.
But I hadn't even really considered that much, I guess, because I was so focused on my mom that Suzanne, your mom, yeah, it really was so much more two-dimensional. Also because I read the book and the book was entirely about her. So, I didn't really notice, and like, what a missed opportunity. And your mom was a lovely singer too. Sorry, we didn't get to hear her.
Not jazz. And the other, not so much jazz, which she was always very honest about. And the other thing is it this? Oh, no, I'm sorry. It may not be this movie. There's a movie where my mom's dancing. Does she dance? No, it's not this one. It's another one.
Did you like jazz, Suzanne?
What's that? Did my mom like jazz?
Like jazz and jazz singing?
She was raised in a home where they didn't allow, my grandma and grandpa didn't allow blues or jazz.
Really?
Yeah, she writes about it in her book. This was an aspiring middle class, they weren't middle class, they were aspiring to be middle class. Yeah. And there was a lot talk about having to conform. So it was a lot of none of that, none of that wild stuff. Let's just go down this straight road. But then she met my dad and his whole world. He was, he co-founded Birdland, my dad did.
Yeah, Monte Kaye's one of the giants. I mean, he managed MJQ and represented a bunch of folks. He was an agent. He did producing too.
I mean, he managed Flip Wilson and George Carlin, and he co-produced the Flip Wilson show and all that. Yeah. Wow. But before that, he was in jazz. That was his world. So he was the jazz guy, and their neighbors were Miles Davis and Francis Davis down the road in a hallway, like down the anyway, my point is, my mom was, what?
No, I'm sorry.
My mom was the least jazz aware of the group. She was kind of the stiff, was the joke. She went out and shopped at Macy's and tried to get them to have this conventional life. And my dad was more he's a white Jewish guy who loved jazz as a kid and all this. So
she did musicals, though. I mean, she was like a musical singer.
She could sing. Yeah, she had a good voice.
What we in this country would have called at that time the classics. She loved, Cole Porter and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Like my mom, the same. My parents evidently they tried out for Oklahoma, and my mom always said that my dad ruined her chances.
Wow, really?
No comment. I don't remember hearing my dad sing a lot. Maybe that's why.
But he played piano. He's playing piano in that piano scene.
Right. Yeah, he played some decent stride piano when he was younger.
Wow.
Okay, I'm gonna take over now, you guys. Thank you so much. This has been a great discussion. we always have great discussions, and it's always just amazing when we get such great guests. Suzanne, thank you so much for popping in there. Nicole, thanks for stopping by. Melissa and Wayne, thank you so much. I have information that I can connect all of you, so don't worry about that. We'll make sure that you get connected. And I'm going to quickly talk about what's coming up next for us at New Plaza Cinema. On Friday, December 4th, we're doing a program in partnership with the Museum of Art and Design. And Max is delivering a lecture on the art of film titles. And so that should be a really good lecture. And then on Sunday, December 13th, we are going to do a movie called Christmas Holiday, a 1944 movie that stars Gene Kelly and Diana Durbin. And it's not a musical. I guarantee you that it's not a musical. It's a film noir Christmas story, sort of. Anyway, you will have to watch it, and you'll have to join us for that discussion. So that will be interesting too. So of course, we'll have the recording of today so everyone can look back on this and kind of unpack where we went with everything, because it was such a great discussion, and we'll get that out to you soon. But thanks everyone. Thanks everyone who participated.
Someone watch the recording of this, because I think my brother would like to see this a lot.
We will send the recording, a link to the recording out to you. We'll make sure that you get it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Care.
Bye-bye.
Great to meet you all. Love your parents.